peer and colleague, Maria Lane, for doing all the organizational work on her end with the technology. It's a pleasure to do these with Maria. We've got a great partnership, and these talks are a really important part of it. Before I introduce Eric, our speaker, I would like to thank Eric McGrain. As we were doing research into talks for this semester, Eric McGrain shared with me the work of Eric Perramond, and I was jazzed, just absolutely jazzed. So I reached out to Eric Perramond, and he was very gracious to agree to visit us, even though we've never had the pleasure to sit down and have a glass of wine or a beer together. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Eric Perramond, a fellow geographer. He's in the Environmental Science and Southwest Studies Department at Colorado College. He recently published a book I believe we're looking at, Unsettled Waters, Rights, Law, and Identity in the American West. I can't think of a more relevant topic as we enter what is likely to be the 22nd year of a deepening drought. If we were face to face, Eric, we would have the bookstore people here selling your book and you signing it, but we can't do that. So if anyone buys the book, Eric, would you be willing to autograph it and send it back to us?
Sure. I guess I've never had such a request, but I'd be delighted to try that.
All right.
Certainly if you have a departmental copy or something.
Adjudication is a process with which many of us are familiar. And Eric takes a very clear look at adjudication to try to figure out how we reconcile private property rights with the public good. That's a question we can talk about for the rest of our lives. Eric spent 10 years in the field on this. He looked at communal water culture, Native American or First Nation rights, talked to a lot of experts and got a lot of different ideas. With that, I am going to introduce our speaker, Eric Perramond from Colorado College, and thank you for your time. I'm going to turn off my audio and video and become a well-behaved audience member. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Namaste, Christopher, and thanks for the invitation to do this. Thanks, Maria, as well. I was joking with Maria before we started today that I would try to do my best to make this a very different talk than what I did back at, wow, was that fall of 2018, which seems like 300 years ago now, when the book had first come out in the fall of 2018. What you have in front of you is really, and it's no accident, it is part of the book cover design, and that really is modeled on Cochiti Dam. That's a piece of art that hangs up here at Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. I ran into it quite literally, almost haphazardly, 2015, as the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center was joining Colorado College as a permanent kind of part of our college. And one of the things that struck me was just like, wow, that looks exactly like Cochiti. And I checked with Chuck Forsman, who is the artist who was really kind enough to allow me to use it as part of the cover art. And sure enough, Chuck is a former arts professor up at CU Boulder, and he said, yep, modeled it on Cochiti Dam right near the outlets. And I thought, well, there it is. That's the argument I'd like to make, sort of this implicit sort of critique about the different kinds of treatment we give to water and then what that does for the social implications. Today, I'm going to spend a little less time on sort of the cultural aspects, the property aspects, a little less time on that, and talk more about what it is that we gain potentially out of a focus on water adjudication. Okay. A lot of my colleagues up here, I've been here since 2005. Are like, why did you pay so much attention to New Mexico? Why didn't you do some here in Colorado? Feeling almost betrayed that I hadn't spent enough time looking at Colorado's water system. And part of it is that in theory, Colorado is already fully adjudicated, even though the adjudication process, which is really just the state asking or you submitting information about what water rights you own as a water user in any state and how that gets counted. In Colorado, it's all individually based. Individuals file with a court, right, voluntarily to have their water rights counted, basically. And a judge in a state court presides over that, firms it up, done. And supposedly, we have a very good count of all this across the state. In New Mexico, they chose a different pathway, which is called a general stream adjudication, which means the Office of State Engineer has to go in once the Attorney General says, okay, we can do this particular stream or this river section, and sues everyone on the sub-basin or the river system to try to make people prove their water rights and to account for that. Now, they've done their research. Usually prior to this, they will have already scoured the archives, done field surveys. Now it would be, satellite imagery. Back in the day, it would have been air photo and on the ground field work with plane tables, if you could imagine that, trying to map out property. And they basically force you to court to make you prove your water rights. This has been going on off and on in theory since 1907 in the Water Code. Actively, it really wasn't until the 1930s, and then it accelerated in the 1960s. But what I find interesting about New Mexico is that you have a much richer overlapping set of legal traditions, right? So an indigenous Native nations conception of water, the longstanding Spanish, quasi-Mexican, really quasi-Moorish water law system called the acequia, which is a community water system. And then finally, you have Anglo-American sort of treatment of water, which treats it much more like a water right as a property, if not a commodity, in the last 20 to 30 years as it's accelerated. But New Mexico does share a lot of similarities with Western states. And one of the things that I really wanted to try to emphasize with the book is what can other states learn from New Mexico, both as a parable, a moral story if you want, but also as a kind of cautionary tale of what you do get out of adjudication, accounting, water, and what you don't, right? So I'm going to move on here. And one of the things I try to emphasize is that, this is really about multiple scales of water as geographers and hopefully as lovers of place, space, excuse me. Let's try that again. Space, scale, place, and landscape. Try to say that quickly. This is to illustrate the multiple views that most of us sort of take for granted and we don't really operate in. But if we start at the most local level here of the acequia, right, the kind of acequia view, really what would have been the conception even prior to Spanish arrival, using natural systems, diverting them lightly, whether that was a floodplain modification prior to Spanish arrival or a canal that runs on each side, right, of these sort of high valley kind of walls here and then irrigates the field in between. And it does take water out of the stream. So they do have impacts. If we scale it up, right, what the state engineer's purview is the oddly jagged, semi-rectangular box that is New Mexico. And though, we know that these waters move in between the states and the atmosphere and the ground, most Western water law, most Western water codes in the Western U.S. are based on this fiction that somehow states have purview over their water, right? And it's a very Lawrence of Arabia kind of attitude towards water, right? So each state has its kind of territoriality over water operations. The truth is, once you blow it up and start to understand how watersheds work, such as the Colorado River Basin, you get a real dimension of how water flows from headwater to its ultimate goal as water in liquid form is to reach the sea, often not reaching the sea, if you know the Colorado River. I wanted to put this slide up especially because it's one I'll return to, because I think in some ways it's about shared narrative and what we all face together. You'll notice that off, the map here of the basin of the Colorado River, just to the east, you'll notice where I am up here at Colorado Springs, and you'll see what the hasher indicates, adjacent areas that receive Colorado River water, not by miracle, but by large pipeline transfers that move that water from Western Colorado to Eastern Colorado. If there were no trans-basin diversions, Eastern Colorado, this whole Front Range would look a lot different. It would look a lot more like northeastern New Mexico. Small villages, dry, ephemeral streams, not enough water really to sustain a large population. Denver might be in better shape because of the Platte. And if we move south, what we both share in common, right, as sort of these urban areas that depend and feed off, partly at least, the Colorado River. Look down here. Oh, familiar territory. Santa Fe all the way down to Las Cruces, all the way down to the border with Texas. Okay. So my point here is that paying attention to these multiple scales of water, is not just geographic, it's inherent. But what's really interesting is that um, very little Western water law scholarship actually fuses those connections in a way that I thought would be interesting as a story. So there it is. Most people don't tell stories about water adjudication for good reasons, because you're just telling stories about court cases. Who wants to read that? I guess I did. But it's really about what adjudications tell us and sort of the scales of water that get illuminated in terms of having people prove either that they have water rights, that they don't, and how those waters connect from state to state, from community to community, and what that does for social relations. I like putting this fight map, as I like to call it, up. This is a Bureau of Reclamation map from 2003. And a really big caveat here is that we have a big task of trying to reconcile all the water needs we face as Westerners, as Southwesterners, right? This illustrates it. So the darkest shading here is this, conflict potential, highly likely, great. And once again, what we have in common here is this whole Front Range, really from Fort Collins down to Pueblo, and also from Santa Fe all the way down to Las Cruces, have exactly the same kind of challenge, right? And it's the same one that, in some ways, Phoenix and Tucson will face. Las Vegas faces this. And if you look at parts of California as well, they have their own challenges, not to mention Salt Lake City. This is without climate change, right? I don't know if you remember those old PSAs about this is your brain, and it was a sizzling egg. And then it was your brain on drugs is actually really hot, and then it's really overcooking. This is an indication of water resources in the West prior to accounting for climate change. I'll come back to this because I think one of the things we get out of adjudication is some kind of accounting of how the states are finally catching up to the reality of what waters actually exist, not the waters they hope to hell exist. And that really is one of the main takeaways, I think, after looking back on this for a few years now since the book's release. So we've paid a lot of attention. Now, I'm going to go back up one slide, trying to understand what climate change will do, how it operates. Most folks who are, academics, and we're doing this kind of work, accept the climate change is real, it's happening, it's anthropogenic, yada, yada, yada. So I'm not here to debate it, but to say that we understand what is happening and what is down the pipeline for climate change on water resources. What's less common is understanding that at the same time we understand that climate change is occurring, very little in water law or water codes is changing, right? So there is this whole concept in the literature that I can share later or discuss later called stationarity. And back in 2008, it was this great little piece that appeared in Science called Stationarity is Dead. And that was basically trying to declare that the average flows of any river, and this was about the Colorado River, are vastly overestimated. And there's never really such thing as an average year anymore. And that we have to get away from the stationarity, the fixed number of averages, to try to accommodate and come up with new water policies. And I thought, oddly, I agreed with it when it came out. I kept nodding about it. And one of the things that really has struck me in this project, sort of like an unintended benefit, is realizing, okay, we've come to accept that the biophysical environment changes, that the amount of water changes, but that our policies toward it, the fixed numbers that are in river compacts, do not. Every state still thinks that they have X or Y million acre feet from every river compact that is divided, whether that's the Rio Grande, whether that's the Colorado River, without really going back to the table to say, okay, guys, we know that 18 million acre feet does not flow through the Colorado River. It's more like 14, if we're being honest, sometimes 13 if it's a bad year. And yet that does not get really worked out as a new accounting. So this means that law and policy have a lot to think about in terms of catching up to the ontology of water, right? What water actually exists. So I thought, okay, fascinating. Let's talk about the software of law, and law as a technology, how that structures things. Again, prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. Is that ever questioned? Rarely in Colorado, considering its nickname is the Colorado Doctrine. That's actually heard that multiple times in New Mexico when I was talking to folks about water law. But what it does tell us is that what may seem like a secure water right because you're a senior water rights owner, you had first dibs on the river or stream, that may give you an advantage for first use and first affirmation of that water right. But if you have an older water right, it also makes you a potential target down the line for water acquisitions, for water brokers, for water purchases, right? If people start finding that 1700, 1750, 1770 water first use dates are attractive if you're a small city or a large city, whether that's Santa Fe, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, Belen, doesn't matter. Cities occupy a space where they are actively acquiring these water rights. So if a lot of the emphasis in New Mexico's first 50, 60 years of water adjudication was trying to firm up these rural water rights, that's also made them more visible to folks who have a strong vested interest in trying to purchase those water rights and to retire them from their old place, move them, so to speak, so that they can be used in a new place like a city or a big agro-industrial complex, if that was the point of them. The real shocking thing for I think most New Mexicans is if they haven't heard or followed water adjudication is that it's been happening for now 114 years in theory, actively probably more like 50 or 60 in terms of aggressive pace of adjudication. And the state is maybe a third, 40% of the way done. That's a long time. Like the water code is older than the actual state of New Mexico, 1907 to 1912. And the fact that it's made so little progress towards firming this up. So this gives you a map understanding, a spatial kind of rough approximate estimate. Here are the pending ones and all the hash marks. Everything that's in white is not even considered in the courts yet. So there might be individual water rights that the Office of State Engineer has knowledge of from these white areas, but it has not entered the court system yet to try to get worked out for trying to firm up who owns this. And why does that matter? When does it start? So largely it is this software, right? This legal system, the policy stuff is driven by immediate infrastructure needs and projects. The ones that, I tended to use in the book because they're immediately palpable and useful is the San Juan Chama project that was proposed as early as the 50s, really didn't start to take shape until the 60s, but drove the OSC really to try to firm up all of these water rights that have some kind of impingement or that are affected by the diverting of water out of the Colorado River basin and diverted through a series of diversions, pipes, transfers, ultimately get into Heron Reservoir, El Vado, all the way down to the Chama to Abiquiu. So the Chama is not really the Chama anymore. It is the Chama plus some San Juan Colorado River basin water until it then, converges just north of Española, a little town called Chamita, which was the original Spanish settlement in New Mexico, and then flows south. And then from there on, can you consider the Rio Grande really just the Rio Grande? No, it's not just the native waters of Chama there, but it also has some Colorado River water. So in order to firm up who had native water rights, and I don't mean that in terms of indigenous peoples, although it should be taken that way, but native water rights that are native to the basin, right? Whether that's the Rio Grande, the Chama, or that new Colorado River water. All of these agencies had to sort out before you can have a dam and an operating agreement to figure out who has water rights before we send this new water into the system, right? It's a bit like you have a bathtub and a neighbor starts dumping little trickles of water into your bathtub saying, well, that's my water. You have to find a way to say like, okay, I guess you get the tub every 30th day based on that flow. So part of this is a really complex accounting that triggers then the lawsuits for any particular drainage. The state goes after small, big, medium water users to try to figure out how much water is in the system, how much is left. Is it fully appropriate? Is it over appropriated? Can they permit more water for that basin? That is the ultimate goal. As a result, especially at the San Juan Chama project, what you had as a result was the two biggest federal lawsuits, for standing period, lasting almost 5 decades each. On the left is the Amet kind of area, which is really just the Pojoaque River Basin that includes Tesuque, Rio en Medio, Nambe, right? You have 4 native sovereign nations, right? Tesuque, Nambe, Pojoaque, San Ildefonso, Pueblo Grant, that all had a vested interest. That is the AMET sort of adjudication lawsuit that then became a settlement. On the right-hand side, this is Taos, right? And this was the Abeta lawsuit. These are all, by the way, AMET, Abeta. These are just the first listed defendant in the lawsuit. Can you imagine being one of those people and those last names become the sort of the nickname for the stand-in of a giant legal water case? And I can only imagine what that must feel like, sort of living in infamy for these water suits. So these were basically target areas for the state to go in, do the mapping, do the surveying, have people try to firm up their water rights. But what I really find fascinating, and sort of the emphasis here and sort of shifting towards the climate and water nexus, is like, what did these water adjudications or settlements tell us about water? Well, one, that there's not enough of it. And that when you go through these adjudication suits, there are these strange kind of conjoined twins that emerge from some adjudications. This was one where AMET, to settle this particular adjudication, the state had to purchase water from this area and like way north of here, actually, in Taos County, to retire a groundwater right, to then retire that from use as groundwater, and then send that water downstream so that it could be pulled out in this area as surface water. If that sounds a little shady, it probably is. So one of the fascinating things with adjudications is that for these two areas to get their allotments and settlements done, for the lawsuit to be basically expunged as an adjudication, and for everyone to walk away with something, the feds had to step in, guarantee hundreds of millions of dollars, and guarantee that the groundwater up at the top of the world farms here on the left-hand side, what you have here sort of being retired, in this hash mark area, that was the groundwater being retired. It was going to be sent down the main stem, right, of the Rio Grande, and then taken out by the folks in the Pojoaque Valley as the same water or the equivalent water to make the AMET settlement work legally. So if that sounds complex, it is. This is sort of the area, and it would be a little north of this juncture. This is the view off the bridge, obviously, of 64 bridge. But this is, the area that has a complex hydrogeological situation, perched water table, basically. And to then say, well, this water is the same as the water that runs down here, which may or may not be accurate on an annual basis. Now, I'm doing this as a way to be playful, to also say this is complicated, because even if this works, and it's remotely the same water, what you have happening across the state are, when groundwater rights or surface water rights are retired in one place, they are then transferred to a new user. They're not magically levitated, those 20 acre feet, and dropped onto the new location, right? These are being pulled out locally and expunged locally. So I fear this treatment of, X water to Y water is never that equal. We're talking about very different areas. You can't send it as a quick deal. And that's really one of the kind of highlights of modern water management. So we've changed our relationship in terms of how we understand waters to be hyperlocal. Here's a ditch crew on an acequia trying to line a ditch, trying to survive a dry summer by trying to improve the efficiency of that ditch. So it's not so porous. It's not just earth and embankment. They're vinyl lining it, basically, to allow for some water to get to the lower part of the ditch. This is in Chupadero, just north of Santa Fe, in a really dry year back in 2009. On top of that, you have what emerged over the last few decades, which is the modern metering of waters as flumes went in to try to track and count water. Okay. As a high modern individual born in 1970, that kind of still makes sense to me. You're counting water. But think of the distant relationship then that has. This person, this mayordomo basically has no access to this, doesn't know what's being measured. It constrains the flow here at the flume and actually creates flood events behind it. It's poorly designed for the drainage. So it's a completely remote kind of relationship with counting water. It involves a new metric, a new conception of water in a way that's both seems natural at this point as a measure. We count water in CFS, cubic feet per second, or acre feet. And what the net result of that sort of degrees of freedom away from working directly with water is how operators of a dam actually view the river today. Here's your Rio Grande as viewed by a dam operator. It's a series of intakes, outtakes, diversions, numbers, who's getting what, where are the outflows and inflows, where are the drainage outlets, all getting currently accounted for. Does that look like a river to you? It does to an engineer. And so part of this is not to make fun of this, right? Is that we need good metrics to try to understand how much water there is, right? This isn't about like being anti-science. It's not about being anti-modernist necessarily, but it is to say that relationship to water has changed so profoundly that we have to understand that, and we have to figure out, what do we get out of adjudication? Is it worth it? If you spend $2, $3, $4 billion over 30, 40 years in a state that's pretty poor to count small water, while all the main stem water just goes by in this sort of complex algorithm and accounting form. Okay, back to this. So what do we get? We get a different kind of water knowledge that's co-produced, right? As water adjudications were done. Imagine being that poor schmuck back in 1907. You're the first territorial engineer in 1907, 1908, and your job is to count all the water in the state. How do you do that? Science doesn't even exist. You have a basic hydrology camp that's established up at Embudo. There are great historical pictures of these people like traipsing over the Rio Grande with buckets and gauges, trying to figure out the science of hydrology. So that, at the same time as the modern conception of water law as a property right, emerge and co-evolve together. And they produce a very elaborate, complex kind of adjudication industrial complex, as I jokingly call it in the book, that has produced a new kind of knowledge. All of it very valuable, none of it finished, and none of it giving any assurance that there's enough water, even now in 2021, for the current needs, much less past needs. At the time the Water Code was written in 1907, it was basically done from a federal standpoint. This Morris Bean guy who used to work for Bureau of Reclamation did it for a bunch of Western states. And he handed the template to New Mexico saying, good luck. And the state of New Mexico adopted it. They already thought in 1907 that the state was fully appropriated for water use. Things have changed and grown since then. I would say one of the main factors that has kept the system afloat since 1907 is the fact that agriculture, as the main employer sector that people are employed, has declined radically. So there's less water use there. And that is where most of the water rights are held. That's where most of the senior water rights are held. And as that agriculture declined or people stopped practicing, most of that water was able to get downstream to cities, right? But had that kept up with the pace even of urbanization, I'm not sure that that would be the same situation today. So what does this give us for the future? I just wanted to share just a few of the little ethnographic quotes that are peppered here and there throughout the book, or that came from interviews, because they speak to this, right? As sort of thinking through both the problems with sharing water that is unknown, certainly as a total quantity to the state of New Mexico, while even Texas and New Mexico fight it out in southern New Mexico in a giant lower Rio Grande adjudication lawsuit. The sort of the fictions that are both social sciencey and natural sciencey about how we think of water, how we count it, how we treat each other over that counting of water. And then this notion of what does a new kind of treatment toward water or attitudes about ecological water do for us? So that last quote is really about, the initiative about trying to keep a Santa Fe River alive in high tourist season in the summer, and they'll do some releases, right, to keep some water flowing in what is a giant urban ditch for the most part until you're past like Frenchy Field in Santa Fe, if you know the area, and then it actually starts to look remotely like a floodplain and not just a concrete kind of irrigation ditch. but this is sort of what adjudication can start to provide, right? If you start looking at where the dependencies for water are, we rely on that Colorado River water almost entirely in Colorado Springs. That's 80% of our water supply coming from the western slope. For y'all down in New Mexico, it's a percentage, but it's not the bulk of it. Where I think the pinch points are is that, all of those adjudication lawsuits were triggered from the San Juan Chama project that brings water in from Navajo Dam into Heron and down the Chama. That's your drinking water. That's what Albuquerque uses almost every day. It provides something like 80 to 95% of your drinking water. Probably about 40 to 35% of the drinking water in Santa Fe is from the Rio Grande, but it's really being provided by that San Juan Chama project. So these aspects that we know the climate is changing, but water quantities are also decreasing. The stationarity and sort of the policy assumptions in the same treatment of law and river compacts can't be the same. This is sort of a new version of the first one that I showed you, Bureau Reclamation, about future fights that might happen. This is a little more recent from National Climate Assessment done in 2014. This was the water supply sustainability risk index, right, by 2050. And you'll notice there are a few key high points. This is, thankfully, that's Denver, so I don't have to worry about too much about that right now. And down here, Albuquerque, and all the way down really through the lower Rio Grande. Again, this is water supply risk in New Mexico without accounting for climate change. Now let's see what happens here. Boom. Oh, that's with climate change. I'll do that again. Without it, with it. Okay, so these are the sort of the more dire implications. So what changes really here from one map to another, if I can toggle back and forth here, all of the Rio Grande becomes a sort of a central hub of concern here in terms of what gets lit up in terms of water supply. So this is using sort of the climate modeling data that we have to try to estimate what will be the large evapotranspiration kind of declines or the desiccation of the Rio Grande River. It doesn't look that much peachier for Colorado. We have a little more snowpack, as you know, we're a headwater state, but you still get the same kind of problematic pattern here for extreme as well. And our neighbors to the south here down in Pueblo, just south of Colorado Springs, have it bad too, if this held up. So, okay, what does that teach us? Well, if it's this bad with climate change, how do we treat water policy differently? One of the things I try to talk about in the book is, how can we start to think of not absolute measures, not absolute quantities of water, but proportional sharing. And when you think about river compacts, they're written with these 1,000,000 acre feet allotted to each state, whether that's the Colorado River Compact 1922, whether it's the Rio Grande Compact, right, that we share in both in Colorado and in Texas at either end for that particular one. They tend to look at the absolute numbers there, but there's built into the mechanism some dependency on percentage without really talking about it in that sense. And what I really return to sometimes is that these small infrastructures, and this is just the Nissekia ditch, have the same challenges as the big infrastructure and our big sort of Western legal geographic challenges for what needs to change in this century if we're going to do this, which is some modification of water codes, some serious modifications of water policy and management at the very least. That's already occurs in New Mexico in some ways. They're called shortage sharing agreements. Does that have the same teeth as law or a permanent legal code change? I would argue it doesn't. It's a bit like still sailing on the Titanic, but you're just bringing better lifeboats aboard so you can survive it if something sinks. And everybody sort of tinkers with the same plan year to year. But really, these are the challenges, is that just as a dry ditch has the same challenges every year to maintain it, to remove sedimentation, to keep that system going, it's a little easier when you have direct access to it. And I think the challenges that New Mexico face with its large infrastructure in trying to refill, say, Elephant Butte Dam. I don't know if you are a frequent dam looker as I am, but I look at those numbers changing month to month. and they haven't changed much. It's like 7 or 8% capacity in Elephant Butte Dam. I mean, the water flow there is so bad coming into the dam that what's developed over the last 20, 30 years is a reverse delta. Like the sedimentation is on the north end before the actual dam because there's not enough river flow coming into the dam. And I think thinking about proportional sharing, the kind of ditch logic and thinking through like, can we just manage the water that actually exists, that we know we have counted and we can depend on, as opposed to the water we would love to see, might be a more logical way for thinking through it. And I think, you know, what's nice about being a geographer is I didn't know any of the stuff prior to moving back out here in 2005, but thinking spatially and in place-based ways through legal papers, through the stories people told about their attachments to villages or ditches or even dam features and recreation, is that it gives us the ability to say, no, this is very much a spatial story. These are about interconnections that water makes across scale, and it doesn't flatten it or obliterate it or eliminate it. It actually makes it that much more important to pay attention to. So what do the small ditches learn from large infrastructure? And what do these, you know, Western states, what can they learn from these small, humble ditches that still operate in space, in time, that are still part of modern water and that function year to year? So I'm going to end it there because 1, I'm drying out, and 2, I would much rather have a conversation with Q&A than me going on and on. So I'll stop share here. And I can come back to any of these slides if you wish, but I'm just going to get back so we can actually see each other a bit. Thanks. Yep, I see Mimi. Wow.
Thank you very much, Eric, for a fascinating talk. I want more. I'm going to buy the book and send it up so you can expect it. Maria, I'm going to hand this off to you to moderate the questions. She may have made me a co-host, but I'm been a little distracted this afternoon. So Maria, I'll hand it back to you, and we can have people open up their mic and belt it out, or we can use the hand waving effort, but I'll leave it in Maria's hands, and I have a question, but I'll wait till the very end. So thanks.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
I'm happy to moderate. Eric, thanks. Lovely to hear this again from another angle. And I'm going to just invite people to either, why don't you put your little hand thing up so that Eric or I can call on you, or just drop your question into the chat and then I can read it and Eric can see the whole question.
I'll try to keep up.
Me too. Who's first? I see Sarah. Go for it.
Hi, thanks, Eric. That was a really interesting presentation.
Thanks, Sarah.
I'm sort of curious to hear about how environmental flows play into this, and if there's any sort of regulations around or water law in the research that you've done around some sort of minimum requirement of how much water should or could stay in the river without totally draining it with these other allocations.
Yeah, well, that's the $64,000 question for New Mexico, isn't it? I mean, you know, in a way, like I feel strange because I'm sort of like the person throwing eggs from Colorado, but it's your river, it's your state water code, and I think one of the first change points I think that has to happen is, instead of having some like 1996 Attorney General's opinion that yes, endangered species can be counted as a beneficial use of the river, it has to be codified. And I know there are people, you know, in the state legislature now, and I would just give props immediately to Representative Melanie Stansbury, who was involved with early aspects on water and was actually part of an adjudication kind of ombudsman suit for Ammit, working with Darcy Bushnell at the Utton Law Center there at UNM. And she really, in some ways, pointed the flashlights for me on a number of issues. But I know that she was key in passing that New Mexico Data Water Act, which is, to me, like, if modernity's worth anything, it's to get us to pay attention to data. If we could do that and actually count accurately and have comparative data across these various sets to understand, okay, how much water is left? Can we make the Office of State Engineer water rights accounting system actually legible to others to look at publicly, and scrubbing some personal info? Can that be shared with other things? So I think those things are kind of the sensitive points that need to be kind of pushed on, because right now there is no mechanism unless the feds step in to say, like, hey, the silvery minnow is about to go extinct. You need to cooperate. And then you get this grudging, like, Middle Rio Grande group consortium, right, that emerged over the last few decades that's done really good work to try to be creative. But there's not a strong legal mechanism to say, like, no, Abiquiu, you're going to release those 500 CFS now, right? It's always this haggling back and forth. And Audubon, New Mexico, trying to purchase water rights to try to get water to the cranes or to the silvery minnow down near Bosque. So I think it has to be New Mexicans driving this change, right, to demand it of their own state senators and representatives, because without that, like, the code will be the code, and you'll continue to just have these, like, attorney get-togethers where they just go, like, oh, isn't the 1907 water code awesome? I'm like, you can change it, right? Like, there are amendments happening to it, and a bunch of them happen for acequias, right? Like, that's the interesting part, is that, like, New Mexico Acequia Association has been really effective at pushing through and lobbying through particular measures. So anything that's like a water transfer or like a water sale. I saw someone mention something about a water lease bill. That's the kind of stuff that NMAA is like, okay, you can do that except acequias, right? Like, they're always good at, like, trying to protect that particular sector and being representatives for, the 800, 900 acequias that still exist in New Mexico. So I think, until someone starts to exert pressure there, you get a big enough consortium of reps and senators saying, like, okay, come on, this is ridiculous. We're like the only Western state that doesn't acknowledge this in our water code. We need to make in-stream or ecological flows part of a beneficial use. Yeah.
Eric, I'm going to read you one from the chat. This is from Daniel Bean. I'm struck by how much of the adjudication process deals with water quantity, and I'm curious about the extent that water quality comes into question.
Excellent.
As water supplies dwindle and streams perch, or as water passes through farms, are there any mechanisms in adjudication to regulate or ensure water quality downstream?
Well, the beauty of that is, the short answer is nope. So, the feds have the Clean Water Act. That's one of their tools. And there is a New Mexico, department tracking water quality, which is, I would argue, severely understaffed for the tasks and work that they do. And I think this is going to sound a little weird, and I mean it in the most earnest way. But one of the benefits of having so many native nation sovereigns, right? I'm talking about the Pueblos here, especially around the Rio Grande, present, is that, a lot of them have not been adjudicated yet. And a lot of those water rights that they have not been settled yet in any kind of negotiation, right? And if you think about the big parties downstream near Albuquerque, who sued Albuquerque over 20 years ago over the quality of water coming from Albuquerque? Yeah, Isleta, right? And they were effective at getting Albuquerque to change their kind of water treatment game. And it's still, like, one of my favorite statistics to this day, that, like, the 5th largest tributary to the Rio Grande is Albuquerque wastewater. Hilarious. That's part of our flow going right back to the system. So I think there are these points where a coupling of native sovereignty or treatment as a sovereign that they can get under the Clean Water Act has real teeth to it. We saw it in that lawsuit between Isleta and Albuquerque. I think on top of that, it does strike me that it's just weird. That's just very strange of our settler colonial approach to all natural resources, that we pockmark, oh, let's separate water quantity from water quality, and let's treat land differently, right, as well. Like, we never conjoin these things. So I think, that's part of that discussion about in-stream flows, because in a way, if you can guarantee water downstream that is supposed to be ecological and of a certain standard and quality, that starts to get at a water quality measure in a system that is all about just counting sheer water. That's all adjudication ever cared about, was just the quantity part.
So I'm going to read another one from the chat, but if anyone wants to ask a question, to unmute and ask a question, just use your little hand raise icon thing so that you come up to the top. All right. So this question, Eric, is from Dagmar Llewellyn,
Yeah, that's a
who
good
is
one.
reading your book and is fascinated by conversation about the conflicts between communal water rights and individual water rights. Question, do you think New Mexico will ever complete adjudications, or will it not because it is contrary to the culture?
Wow. Can I just leave now? No, that's a great question. But I mean, that again, you're in New Mexico. I'm not. And I think part of what is really interesting is I think work is only complete if the people demand it, or if there's enough tax base or resources given to that task. So there is a real tension here, because I have, out of the 274 interviews or something ridiculous like that I did over the years, there was a really interesting split between those folks, even on acequias, who like feared adjudication, thought it was a total waste of time, and didn't want to deal with the state. But then we had a serious component of folks who like, absolutely, I want to get my dink so I can prove my water rights. I've got the papers. I am ready, right? And I want those damn water rights. So I think the notion that, that I had, well over a decade ago of like, yeah, these people are, like comuneros. They don't care about private property rights. They're going to stay together in their villages and they believe in community. No, like that's a romantic illusion that was sold to me in John Nichols' book. So I think, what really comes across is that tension, the work that the state did and sort of selling in the 1907 Water Code, that like, yeah, you have private water rights. We're just here to affirm them, has gained traction. I think where people get nervous is when people, their neighbors start to sell water rights on a ditch. Well, the assumption the state makes is that, okay, that water will not be taken out by anybody on the ditch anymore. Is that how you think it works? Right? Like, you get into these long conversations with people saying, well, yeah, I mean, I sold my water rights, but sometimes I'm still taking water from the ditch. This is statewide. So I think what's really happening here is that you've heard the term double dipping for Western water rights, is that people will sell their water rights, but they're still like maintaining some access sometimes. That's interesting. I don't talk about it much in the book because I'm not there to rat people out. But that's reality. People will find ways to get the water they need, even if they've sold their water rights. On a community level, I think, if you're part of a changing community that used to be, let's say, 90% Hispano, and since the 70s is now maybe 50% Hispano, 40% Hispano, 30% Hispano, you get a little more mosaic about what people are there for. Are they there to farm? No, they might sell their water rights. That water would leave the ditch. And that leads to basically desiccation of a acequia system. It makes it harder to maintain the system because people don't care. They're not going to spend the time like sending out a peon to clean out the ditch, right, every spring. So it's a different mindset. And I think, there are enough internal challenges to acequias that they don't need climate change or water brokers coming to them to try to, take more water. They have their own challenges already. Especially since, the decline of agriculture means that you have a lot less families, a lot less kids doing this generationally.
All right, Eric, we got a couple of people lined up. So let's do Eric McGrain first and then Bob Zerniak.
All right, another Eric.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. There's a group of us that are doing some acequia research, and we've been reading your book and discussing it the last couple of weeks, and it's been very useful for us. And the talk was as well. So I have a question, kind of jumping up. You just finished with the acequias in your response to the last question, but I want to think about that in relationship to this. The big critique of the way that water policy is set up, that yeah, that you mentioned essentially the counting of water in absolute numbers, right? So I mean, like the Colorado River Compact, the 18 million versus 14 million that you mentioned. I mean, so that sort of, measurement is problematic, as you said, like looking at climate change in 2050, and I mean, for many reasons. So thinking with the Acequia communities as examples, right, there is the Circo, right, kind of like the more fluid measurement that's more a relative measurement. So besides that example, are there instances of Western states or anywhere else that you can point to that are examples of actually effective management of water based on this sort of relative measurement that accounts for this average never being average, and most of the compacts being based on water that actually isn't accurate, that would be useful for policymakers to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, I think, some of this is really challenging because it tests my limit for explanation and understanding. So let me try to, I think what really needs to happen is a little more honest brokering of water and in terms of the policy. So make things that are implicit built into river compacts more explicit. Like, this notion of like calling them shortage sharing agreement. Okay. Like if that makes people feel better year to year or in a 5-year plan, cool. They're going to do it anyway on the Colorado River, especially, or in New Mexico, right? Like MRGCD operates on a shortage sharing agreement. So that's already there. It's built into the fabric of it. It's just not framed that way. So I think part of this is like, how explicit do we want to make it? How codified do you want to make it? Do you want to keep the old bones and just understand that you're like shaking them up to like change bits and bits to pieces as you negotiate with other water users every year? That's sort of our current approach, right? Like every time there's a shortage on the Colorado River, everyone panics in every Western state. They send a representative up to see like what can happen. Are we going to do, demand management in the upper basin states? Everybody like blinks and then they walk away. And then it's the lower basin states doing all the work. And I think the same is true for New Mexico, is how much do you want to formalize this? Because in a way you've gone from an organic to an inorganic economy. So, the old gestures that these mayordomos used to say, like, okay, you get one surco. And they would literally like make a hand gesture of like the volume of water that was necessary for that field, to one where they're measuring in cubic feet per second, which they'd be like, what, how much? Oh, that's like 1 cubic feet per second. Oddly enough, is close to a surco. Okay, I can work with that. But once you get to things like acre feet a year, that's like, you're using what? A football field as a standard for like measuring how much water you're distributing for my cattle on alfalfa? Like what are you talking about, man? Right. So I think recognizing that some of our measures are complete just fictions and abstractions that make no sense. Good. But use that as the upper measure, right? So like, even if a pecan farmer gets 8 acre feet per acre of water, that's a lot of water. Right. 1 acre foot is 325,000 gallons. And you're getting 8 acre feet for a pecan. They need to understand that's the upper limit, not like they can use that every year. Right. Like, I think that's what the implicit to explicit needs to be changed. Now, if you're stuck, down near the Elephant and Butte Dam and you're a pecan farmer and you're in the EBID district, well, they'll restrict you anyway, right, on water based on its availability. You won't get the absolute total measure of it. But I think that's the kind of aspect that's really slippery, right? Is like once you tell Westerners, okay, you have up to 20 acre feet of water, you have water rights to that. People are like, yeah, okay, great. Send it all. Give me all those 20 acre feet. That's the upper limit. And I think what's happened is that's become a really hard cemented kind of property fiction in people's minds, that they can always access those 20 acre feet. It'll always be there. Regardless of what it does to neighbors. I don't know if that helps at all, but to me, that's the real problem, is that we're dealing with hard numbers and yet with soft relations with others that have to be accounted for.
All right, Bob.
So Eric, thanks for the talk. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I noticed on your water severity map, shortages, that the Ogallala Aquifer plays a pretty large role. I just wondered, back in the Carruthers administration, he actually talked about community suicide, people walking away from their communities because there was no reason to be there. Have you had given any thought to the possibility of communities in the Northeast in particular disappearing because of water shortages?
Yeah, I mean that's a good framing of it, you know, Bob, because in some ways that's what every kind of groundwater district, right, is operating on the assumption that, okay, we will agree to a slow extinction of this aquifer based on an annual rate, right, of their water use. That's what happens to the Ogallala. That's what's actually happening in the San Luis Valley, right?
Yeah.
Talk about an aquifer area that, you know, that depends on the Rio Grande as sort of like some version of a base flow contributor, but is shared between New Mexico and, you know, and Colorado. They're facing the same challenges there too, based on the fact that they've overmined that aquifer. It used to be artesian, right? Like you look at the old historical photos of the San Luis Valley, people would bore a hole and you'd get these jets of water shooting up dozens of feet. Now you are pumping hundreds of feet down to get to a water table that is constantly being depleted. The Ogallala, you know, we knew this even before the San Luis, that was going to be the case. And yet you have places in North Texas that have formed these, as you say, collective suicide of groundwater pumping because, you know, at some point it ends, right? Like the replenishment rate isn't the same as the takeout rate. So it's a bit like, you know, a co-op that shares the same savings account and everybody's taking out of it. And there's barely any replenishment coming into it. At a certain point, you run out of savings. And I think, you know, the conjunction of both groundwater and surface water, you know, for most states would be a logical first step. But, you know, if you're talking about the high plains with no available surface water rights and all you have is groundwater, that's what you're left with.
Yeah.
It's pretty tough.
Thanks.
Hey, Eric, with your permission, can we keep it going a few minutes? We've got a number
Sure.
of questions still in the chat. Okay.
I'll do my best.
And I'm actually going to hand off to Chris Brown to read some of those out. Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome, Maria. Thank you for working to set this up. Let's start with Laura Pasca's question, and then I'll look back and see if we have others. Are there any states or basins that are handling climate change, future supplies and demands in ways that might offer useful models or examples for New Mexico? She acknowledges the uniqueness of New Mexico. Is anyone doing something particularly right that we can look toward? Thanks. That's a great question. I await the answer.
Yeah, so do I, Laura. I feel like journalists are sometimes in a better position than we are as academics. But this notion of, you know, where do you look for success stories? I think there are success stories local to New Mexico that I don't get a chance to highlight as much. Whether that's the Chama agreement, you know, to have the Pueblos and the Acequias not sue each other, and overall in terms of, you know, water management, I would argue that if adjudication gets finished in New Mexico, the way that the OSC does it in the state actually accounts for, miraculously, the consumptive use of water, not just all like total net water rights being folded out, right? Like how much water is actually being used in any particular place. No other Western state does that. Not a single one. So there's a little, you know, plus symbol to the column for New Mexico, because they actually, once they're done with this, they'll actually know how much water is being used on a annual basis, roughly. They're old data, and that would be my only cautionary kind of note there to that good news. But I think there are plenty of good stories about states that are doing interesting things. Arizona, oddly enough, right, for as messed up and dry as that state is and how dependent on the Colorado River is, they've actually picked up their game when it comes to working with the Colorado River Indian tribes, right? CRIT is their kind of nickname and acronymized in the water circles, but they've done interesting networking across the cultural divide and the sovereign divide to try to figure out, okay, if the river dries out down to this amount, how do we work with CRIT to send enough water to Phoenix and Tucson and try to manage these things? They're actually collaborating in some ways that can seem heavy-handed in some ways, but they were one of the few states that when the feds sort of threatened the Western states on the Colorado River, like, look, we're going to step in and start allocating water here if you don't get your together. Arizona actually did the hard work. California was like, no, we'll just take all the water anyway, because that's what California says all the time. Colorado sort of punted and be like, yeah, maybe someday we'll do demand management. And Utah was sort of like, what are you asking us to do? So that's my comic approach to the describing of, positive stories. But I think some states are really doing hard work. In the Pacific Northwest, I think, ecology at Washington and in Oregon, those are sort of the water agencies, up in Oregon and Washington are doing interesting things that have to do with the coupling of water with species. Now, that's really different, right, from sort of our exotic streams like the Colorado and Rio Grande, because we have water fights, and it's literally about water. In the Pacific Northwest, that water is actually about fish fights. It's about salmon, right? In terms of the volume of water, the problems with dams, native sovereigns that fight with each other. But there are some accords that are being worked out that are interesting collaboratives, like the Salish Collaborative for salmon. That's a really interesting kind of example for thinking through what might be possible. When I look internationally, I guess I get a little pessimistic because I don't see shining models of sustainability. There are folks in the Southwest who really like the Australian model of like coming up with, water markets, but the Murray-Darling is a really stressed system. And if you've paid attention to their droughts recently, I don't know if that's a good news story or like small heartwarming stories in the middle of like a Mad Max kind of climate scenario for the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, but they at least are forced, right, to actually start to think of more creative solutions. And I think in the Western US, we've mostly escaped the worst so far, with a few excepting years, like 2002, which was just ridiculous. But I don't know if that comes close to telling, but I think, there are positive stories in every single state. They just don't get told. And I don't think they get scaled up by water agencies to pay attention to be like, oh yeah, we could do that in like these other 12 basins and do it better. I will say that, again, those states that have conjoined groundwater with surface water management are in better shape than those that just recently did it, California, or those that almost refused to deal with it as conjunctive management, Texas. So.
Thank you, Eric. I'd like to go back up a little bit in our list. Roland Kern has a question. Do you think future conflict will arise between areas or states that cloud seed to increase local rainfall versus areas where that rain would have fallen naturally? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's almost so granular. I want to make jokes about fiction and water fiction and cli-fi, because like there are some great like fictional works out there that treat these things like, what are the future of climate wars and how do we deal with each other? And again, I'll put in another empty plug for The Water Knife. If you haven't read that by Paolo Bacigalupi, that's a great little book if you can deal with the torture scenes. But anyway, that set aside, I think that's a very localized kind of dimension that is not going to be feasible in the long term. One, because like who has access to metric tons of silver iodide on a frequent basis? And the benefits you get out of that are not worth the costs. So if this was something where, it was predictable on a weekly basis and you had one of these like climatic sort of streams of moisture coming over you in Durango, like on a weekly basis, you had a good budget. Okay, maybe then, and maybe the Ute would be pissed off at you, or Pagosa Springs, if they're on the lee side, not getting that moisture. But I don't really see that part of the sort of the micro scale of geoengineering having much traction there. I'm a little skeptical about all geoengineering just because, I don't think we quite understand what the return boomerang would be like if you start chucking emissions into the atmosphere on a larger scale, or injecting particles, to refract more sunlight to lower the temperature. Like at that point, we're just treating the earth like a tinker set, like an industrial chemical experiment. Well, we're already doing that, but like treating it like 12-year-olds as opposed to like adults in the room. And I'd fear the consequences of that, frankly.
Thank you. We have a question from Bo Romero. What discussions have you encountered regarding efficiency of water transport and or usage? Are there any policies or initiatives that encourage such action?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not entirely sure in what like context or scale Bo's talking about, but I mean, like when I go back to the like the ditch metaphor, I immediately think about the ditches that I visited that are unlined, just earthen, right, versus the ones that are like concrete, right? So the concrete transfer, in water, there's going to be some evaporation, but it's not seeping in to the sides of the banks, right? There's a little less maintenance cost once you've paid for the actual concrete. You don't get as much damage from beavers and muskrats, which are the bane of like, earthen canal acequia farmers the world over. So there's that gain in efficiency. But when you do line a canal with concrete or something more permanent, you also lose a lot of that kind of expansion of the riparian vegetation, which means you're no longer going to have bird habitat. All the cottonwoods are going to die. All the willows are going to die. And you might get some like salt cedar that remains, tamarisk, that'll survive that, trying to scrabble out a living there. It'll change basically the ecology of the system. And, it may be that the particular valleys are going to get so dry that they'll, go to a permanent lining or a permanent concrete. But I always like to think that, what these canals have done, and it's not like they don't have ecological costs, right? Like once you take water out of the river and you send it on both sides of the bank, you're taking water out of what might be the natural fishery there. So maybe no more trout. Okay. But you do expand that floodplain to a huge kind of lush green space that other species still will use, right? Deer will still cross it. Birds will still fly to it and nest in those trees. You still have riparian vegetation. It expands what would be a thin kind of riparian river corridor to almost the whole floodplain in terms of a green space. And all you have to do is go through northern Mexico and drive up and down through those dry valleys. And it's like dry as a bone, green, dry as a bone, green, dry as a bone, green. Like it becomes predictable. It's New Mexico's own little acequia basin and range country.
We have a comment from Daniel Bean, which I think there's a question hiding in there. Yep. Not really a question, Bass. Pecan farmers in EBID do get their full duty, right? They make up the shortages in the surface water by pumping more to the tune of maybe 4.5 to 5 acre feet per day. So maybe you could speak a little bit about that trade-off between a shortage of a surface water right, but I got a well and I got diesel.
Yeah, and that's really, again, the situation in southern New Mexico is a little more grim, right? You're not anywhere close to snowpack. You're totally dependent on the runoff coming from northern New Mexico or what might be there locally in terms of groundwater, and that's a really tough situation. It's a bit like designing a city in the middle of a desert. It's like, oh, this seems good for the first 20 years, but a pecan farmer made this joke, so it's not mine, but she said something like to the effect of like, you may think we're nuts for farming pecans here in the middle of a desert. I thought, okay, that's a good joke, but yes, I do think it's kind of nuts. I mean, I understand it because the demand, right, for either pecans, or if we're making fun of California now just for a second, almonds, right? People love to beat up California for almonds. It's like, did you know that like a whole gallon of water gets concentrated into one almond? I'm like, yes, I know that statistic. Thank you, student. So I think this notion of like the hard choices that farmers face has to be recognized. And if we're not providing alternate crops, a kind of extension to think through like, okay, look, this is how much water you actually have. You can't just raise cotton anymore. You can't just raise high demand pecans, but this crop will get you this same price. I might be responsive to that as a farmer, but I think that's It's making a big assumption about how people view themselves. Trying to change a cattle rancher to a sheep farmer is a little tough. That's why there were wars. I think it's just as hard to say, look, we know you're a multi-generation pecan farmer, but we really like you to take this whole field and turn it into hemp, and we'll give you the same price. They'd be like, I don't want to be a weed farmer. No, it's not weed, it's hemp. So I think these conversations about what are the equivalent crops that might give you the same price per acre are the conversations that are worth having. I think to just constantly, beat up folks for, isn't it dumb to grow alfalfa in the middle of the desert, and they're just going to like stare at you until you retract the question, is not the way to go. We've all made those mistakes. I mean, God, I can't even imagine. I can't even recollect how many dumb questions I asked folks, and they would just stare at me like, where are you from, son? I'd be like, all right, you're right. That was a big presumption. I get to talk about the stuff, not depend on it for a living, right? To sell pecans. So I think these questions are really hard, but they're doing what's allowed under law. So there's a perfect example, right? That if people can supplement water, or I love this term when people talk about, because it sounds like plastic surgery, water augmentation plans, right? I need an enhancement on my field, if you know what I mean. I need a water augmentation plan. Like, you're just taking water from somewhere else and dumping it on your field. All right, let's be honest, right? Cities do this, fields do this, farmers do this. Whole districts try to talk about water augmentation plan as if it's water not coming from some other reservoir, some other place. We're going to have to deal again with the water we have, not the water we imagine we can use, right? And that's where, the state office of the state engineer has the ability to intervene. But man, I mean, getting into the ground politics of who gets to plant what, that's something that's also not addressed at all in policy, right? Like, it gets locked in under adjudication. It's like, okay, here's your water duty, DUTY. And that's the number of acre feet per acre that person has rights to based on, at the time, what they were planting. That can change over time, but farmers have to put in an application or notification of what they're changing it to. So that is not easy, because that gets into property rights that are land-based and not just water-based. And because we have different policies for each thing, we think of land property as sacred, right? Like, get off my lawn, versus water rights, which are contingent on how much water is available in any given year. There's no winning there. But I think that balance between surface water and pumping is, that's Robert Glennon's original book, Water Follies. Like, that whole book is about that challenge and that dimension. Charles Bowden's book, Killing the Hidden Waters, 1977. Like, that book is also about groundwater sacking, right? And how much we've mined groundwater in the West to subsidize this existence of, farming or modernity.
Thank you very much for the questions. Out of consideration for our visiting speaker, who probably doesn't want to go another hour, I would like to call it there and thank our audience for coming today. I love our partnership with UNM because it's just a hoot to co-sponsor these talks. And a big thank you to Eric McGrain for suggesting that we reach out to you, and a larger thank you to Eric Perramond for joining us today. My former student, who's also my wife's former worker bee, lives in Colorado Springs.
Aha.
So we like to come up there every now and then to visit.
Nice.
And when we do, I'll bring you a fine bottle of wine that Bob Zerniak and I will pick out of our Southern New Mexico holdings, just to say thank you, because this was really great. And we're all ready to be done with the pandemic so we can visit with people like you. And I just want to thank you again. With that, I'll turn the rest of the group free. Eric, thanks so much. Be well and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks. I really appreciate it, Christopher. And thanks for everyone who showed up and asked such, light questions like, what's our future? Is there water left? No, I'm just joking. I really appreciate it. It's fun to do this and actually see some human faces again.
All right, well, thank you. Eric, I'll let you step off before
Thanks.
someone asks you another darn question. And with that, I just thank our visitors today, the people that organized this. It was great to see some names on the panels I haven't seen in way too long. Eric, be well and have a good weekend.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Stay in touch.
Bye-bye. Maria handed the helm off to me, but I'm going to step off as well. I got to go be a parent. I got a 16-year-old daughter and it's time to pick her future classes. I better go be a dad. So with that, I'll close the session. Thank everyone for coming. I hope you have a good weekend. Bye-bye.